The morning air bit at Jihoon's skin as he forced himself out of the straw mat. His breath fogged in the dim, freezing room, the frost creeping like veins across the cracked window. He turned to look at his son. Dongwook, only 8 years old, lay curled under a thin quilt, his ribs pressing against the fabric like sharp ridges. Even in sleep, his lips moved as though chewing, dreaming of food that never came. Jihoon sat quietly for a moment, staring at the boy. His heart tightened. Every day he asked himself the same question. How much longer can I keep him alive? The village outside was gray and silent, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the sound of boots striking frozen earth. The soldiers patrolled every street, their eyes cold and searching, always watching for weakness or disobedience. Even hunger could be a crime if it made a man desperate enough to steal. Jihoon pulled on his patched coat and prepared for another day of hauling coal. The job broke his back, left his hands raw and blackened, but it was the only way to get the meager ration that never filled their stomachs. He thought of his wife, how she used to laugh softly even when hunger gnawed at them. She had wasted away years earlier, her body surrendering to malnutrition. Her absence weighed on Jihoon like a stone he carried each day. When Dongwook awoke, he rubbed his eyes and looked at his father. "Appa, will there be porridge today?" His voice was weak but hopeful. Jihoon swallowed the lump in his throat. He lied gently. "Yes, my son. Just a little later." In truth, there was barely a handful of cornmeal left. That night, after finishing his shift, Jihoon slipped into the forest near the edge of the village to gather firewood. The forest was forbidden after dusk, but he had no choice. The boy would freeze otherwise. The crunch of snow under his feet echoed in the silence. He bent to gather twigs when a faint rustling froze him in place. Jihoon's hand tightened around the axe handle. His eyes searched the shadows. From behind a cluster of trees, a figure emerged, a gaunt woman clutching a child. Their faces were hollow, pale, eyes wide with terror. And in that instant, Jihoon knew this night would change his life forever. Jihoon froze, his breath caught in his throat. The woman clutched the child tighter, her trembling body shielding the boy as if Jihoon himself were the enemy. Her hair was matted, her lips cracked, and her eyes sharp, yet terrified, searched for mercy. The child beside her looked even worse. Skeletal arms wrapped around his mother's waist, his face so thin it seemed carved from bone. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible over the wind. "Don't call the soldiers." Jihoon blinked, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The forest was no place for villagers at this hour. Curfew meant prison, or worse. Then realization struck like thunder. These weren't ordinary villagers. Their torn uniforms, the bruises on their wrists, the way they flinched at every sound. They were escapees from a labor camp. His pulse quickened. To harbor them would mean death for both him and Dongwook. The regime's punishment was merciless. But when he looked into the child's eyes, he saw his own son's reflections, starving, frail, desperate for one more day of life. Where did you come from?" Jihoon asked, his voice trembling. The woman hesitated. Then, with tears forming, she whispered, "Camp 22. Jihoon staggered back. He had heard rumors of Camp 22, whispers of endless torture, starvation, executions. Even mentioning it aloud was dangerous. And yet here they were, standing before him like ghosts brought back from the dead. The woman lowered her head. "We escaped 3 nights ago. We've been hiding, running. But the soldiers are close. They'll find us." She clutched the boy's thin hand. "Can't walk much longer." Jihoon's chest ached as he glanced back toward the village. If the patrol dogs caught their scent, it would be over. He knew what he should do: walk away, pretend he never saw them. But as the boy shivered violently, Jihoon thought of Dongwook's weak smile, his whispered questions about food. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Jihoon made his choice. "Follow me," he said quickly, gesturing toward his hut. Quietly, the woman gasped in disbelief, clutching her child. For the first time, hope flickered in her hollow eyes. Jihoon led them through the trees, every step heavy with fear. With each snapping twig, he imagined soldiers bursting from the shadows. One dog's bark could end them all. Yet as he glanced back at the fragile boy stumbling beside his mother, Jihoon knew there was no turning back. The one-room hut smelled of damp straw and boiled weeds. Ji-hoon had little to offer, but as the woman and her child entered, their eyes widened as if they had stepped into a palace. Dong-wook sat up weakly from his mat, confusion washing over his pale face. "Appa, who are they?" he asked, his voice soft and raspy. Ji-hoon hesitated, then forced a smile. "Friends. They just need a place to rest." The boy's hollow eyes flickered to the child clinging to his mother. For a moment, there was silence to children staring at each other. Both too thin, too fragile, their innocence buried under hunger. Ji-hoon searched the small clay pot near the fire. A thin soup of wild grass and roots simmered inside, barely enough for Dong-wook, let alone 3 more mouths. Still, he poured the watery broth into 4 wooden bowls, pushing his own portion aside for the strangers. The woman tried to refuse. "We can't take this. You have a child?" Ji-hoon shook his head firmly. "If the boy starves, I won't forgive myself." As they ate in silence, Ji-hoon studied them. Their movements were careful, haunted. Even the boy, though clearly starving, ate slowly, as if afraid someone might rip the food from his hands. When Dong-wook dozed off, the woman finally spoke. Her name was Yoon-hee, and her son was Min-jun. She told him about the labor camp, how prisoners worked until their bones cracked, how guards beat anyone who faltered, how hunger was a weapon more cruel than chains. Ji-hoon clenched his fists as she described children collapsing in the fields, mothers forced to watch executions, men disappearing after a single whispered complaint. "We had nothing left," she said, her voice breaking. "If we stayed, Min-jun would die. So, we ran." Her words pierced Ji-hoon's heart. He had always known suffering, but the camps were another level of horror. And now, by sheltering them, he was carrying their burden too. That night, Ji-hoon lay awake. Every bark in the distance made his chest tighten. Every gust of wind sounded like boots crushing the earth. He turned his gaze toward Dong-wook and Min-jun, sleeping side by side. 2 boys, strangers by blood but bound by survival. Ji-hoon realized then, protecting them all was no longer a choice. It was his duty. The next morning, the fragile peace inside Ji-hoon's hut shattered with the sound of boots crunching outside. Soldiers. Their voices drifted through the thin walls, sharp and commanding, searching. Yoon-hee froze mid-breath, clutching Min-jun against her chest. Ji-hoon quickly motioned for silence, his heart pounding so loud he feared it would give them away. Dong-wook sat up, confusion in his tired eyes, but Ji-hoon pressed a finger to his lips. The soldiers' shadows slid across the cracks in the wooden walls like dark claws. One of them laughed harshly. "The fugitives can't have gone far. Search every shack. Even rats leave a trail." Ji-hoon's throat tightened. His hut was one of the poorest in the village, barely worth notice, but suspicion could fall on anyone. Yoon-hee's face was pale, her lips trembling as though every breath might betray them. Thinking quickly, Ji-hoon grabbed a bundle of firewood and stepped outside, forcing a weary smile. "Comrades," he greeted, bowing. "What brings you here?" One soldier sneered. "We're hunting a woman and her brat, escaped laborers. Have you seen anyone?" Ji-hoon shook his head with practiced calm. "I only have my boy. We were gathering roots by the river yesterday. Saw nothing." The soldier's eyes narrowed, scanning Ji-hoon's gaunt frame, the patched clothing, the emptiness of his yard. Nothing suspicious yet. Another soldier kicked at the door, making Yoon-hee and Min-jun flinch silently inside. Ji-hoon forced a laugh. "Careful, the hut might collapse if you push harder." The men chuckled, muttering insults about peasants, then moved on. Ji-hoon waited until their footsteps faded before slipping back inside. He collapsed to her knees, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You risked your life for us," she whispered. Ji-hoon sat heavily on the floor, his chest still heaving. He looked at Dong-wook, then at Min-jun, who clung to his mother's tattered sleeve. For the first time, Ji-hoon realized that every decision now balanced on a knife's edge one slip, and all of them would be dragged into hell. The fear that had hung in the air lingered long after. Even the children felt it. Dong-wook no longer asked questions, and Min-jun didn't smile. In the silence, Ji-hoon understood. They weren't just hiding from soldiers. They were hiding from death itself, and death was patient. The nights grew colder, and Ji-hoon's small hut seemed to shrink, as if the walls pressed closer with each passing day. Survival demanded silence, not just in words, but in footsteps, in the way Min Chun's little hands reached for food, in the way Min Chun's sobs had to be swallowed before they left her throat. Dong Wook, though still a child, began to notice the heaviness in the air. He sat quietly near Min Chun, sharing scraps of boiled corn or a single piece of wild root Ji-hoon managed to dig up from the frozen ground. One night, when the wind howled like a wounded beast outside, Dong Wook whispered, "I'll protect you." Min Chun's eyes widened, too young to grasp the danger, but he leaned into Dong Wook's shoulder as though believing it. Min-hye watched the boys with a bittersweet gaze. Ji-hoon caught her expression, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Your son is strong," she murmured softly. Ji-hoon shook his head. He shouldn't have to be. Every day was a test of restraint. Yoon-hee longed to tell her story, but words carried weight that could betray them if overheard. Instead, she poured her strength into caring for Min-jin, wrapping his feet with torn fabric to keep the frost away. Ji-hoon, meanwhile, risked longer treks into the forest, feigning normalcy so no one would question why his hut seemed too quiet. At night, when sleep was impossible, Ji-hoon sometimes caught Yoon-hee staring into the fire's dying glow. Their eyes would meet briefly, unspoken truths passing between them. She was haunted. He was weary. Yet in that silence, something fragile took root in understanding that they were bound together, not by choice, but by necessity. One evening, as Min Chun coughed from hunger, Ji-hoon broke a precious piece of dried potato and handed it to Yoon-hee. She hesitated, shaking her head, but Ji-hoon pressed it into her palm. "Feed the boy," he said. His own stomach twisted with emptiness, but he forced himself to look away. In the silence that followed, Yoon-hee's tears fell silently. Ji-hoon pretended not to see, but inside he felt a strange, painful warmth. Fear still ruled their lives, but amid the shadows, a fragile bond was forming, one built, not on words, but on sacrifice. The idea of escape was a dangerous flame bright enough to offer hope, but quick to burn anyone who reached too close. For weeks, Ji-hoon suppressed it, burying the thought under the weight of survival. Yet each day he watched Yoon-hee and her son weaken, and each day his own conscience pressed harder against the silence. One night, when the fire had dimmed to embers, Yoon-hee broke that silence. Her voice was a whisper so soft, Ji-hoon almost thought it part of the wind. "We cannot stay here forever." Ji-hoon froze. The words were reckless, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. He wanted to scold her, to remind her that even walls had ears in North Korea. Instead, he sighed, leaning closer. "Escape means death if we fail." Yoon-hee nodded, clutching Min Chun, who slept in her arms. "But if we stay, death comes slower and crueler." Dong Wook stirred awake, his young eyes heavy with drowsiness but sharp enough to catch the word. "Escape?" he asked timidly. Ji-hoon hushed him, but the boy's question lingered like smoke in the room. Over the next few days, whispers of escape returned, this time less like a fantasy and more like a plan. Ji-hoon recalled paths he had once taken to hunt trails few villagers knew, leading dangerously close to the river. Rumors always swirled about guards, dogs, and mines, yet he remembered something else too. Certain parts of the river froze so thick that even soldiers avoided them, fearing collapse. Still, fear gnawed at him. To leave was not only to risk his life, but Dong Wook's. He wrestled with the thought, often staring at his son's thin frame as the boy clutched his belly in hunger. If he failed, the punishment would not stop with him, it would ripple through his family like poison. And yet Yoon-hee's desperation was unshakable. One evening, when Ji-hoon handed her a stolen piece of bread, she looked at him with eyes full of both gratitude and resolve. "You saved us once," she whispered. "Save us again." Ji-hoon felt his throat tighten. For the first time, the whispers of escape no longer felt like madness. They felt like destiny calling an impossible, perilous road, yet the only one left. The night they chose was darker than usual, the moon swallowed by a heavy blanket of clouds. The village lay silent, save for the occasional bark of a stray dog or the rustle of dry winter branches. Ji-hoon sat by the dying fire, staring at the glowing embers, as if they could answer the storm inside him. Beside him, Dong Wook slept restlessly, his ribs rising and falling under the thin quilt. Dong-hee sat on the other side, rocking Min Chun quietly. For hours no one spoke. Each of them knew the weight of what was about to happen. It. Finally, Ji-hoon broke the silence. If we leave, there is no coming back, he said, his voice low but steady. If the soldiers catch us, they will shoot us on the spot or worse. Yoon-hee met his gaze, her face pale with hunger, held a strength he could not deny. Ji-hoon, we are already dying here. Better to die running toward hope than waiting for despair to finish us. Her words cut through him like a blade. He had thought himself the protector, the one carrying their burdens. Yet here she was, reminding him that courage did not belong only to men. As the hours dragged on, Ji-hoon's decision hardened like the river ice. He gathered the few belongings they could risk, carrying a small satchel with dried corn husks, a rusted kettle, and a threadbare blanket. Dong-wook stirred awake, blinking up at his father. Are we going somewhere? Ji-hoon bent down, brushing his son's hair back gently. We're going somewhere safe, he whispered, though fear made his words tremble. Just before dawn, they stepped outside. The cold bit their skin, but the air felt sharper, alive with a strange mix of dread and hope. Ji-hoon took one last glance at the small hut he had called Homa, place of suffering, yes, but also the place where he had dared to dream again. He tightened his grip on Dong-wook's hand. Stay quiet, stay close, he instructed. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. Yet for the first time in years, Ji-hoon's steps were not weighed down by fear alone. They were guided by the faint glimmer of freedom. The frozen earth crunched beneath their feet as the small group moved silently through the night. Ji-hoon led the way, every step measured, every breath shallow. Dong-wook clutched his father's hands so tightly that Ji-hoon could feel the boys trembling through his own veins. Behind them, Yoon-hee cradled Min-jun, pressing the child's head against her chest to muffle even the softest whimper. The border was still hours away. They had slipped past the edge of the village, weaving through barren fields and narrow paths Ji-hoon had memorized in childhood. Yet danger lingered everywhere: patrols, informants, neighbors desperate enough to trade human lives for a bowl of rice. Then it happened. From the shadows of a broken fence came a low growl. Ji-hoon froze, his heart leaping to his throat. Out of the darkness emerged a mangy, half-starved dog. Its eyes glinted in the faint moonlight. For a brief moment, Ji-hoon prayed it would pass. But the dog lifted its head and unleashed a shrill, piercing bark that ripped through the silence like a gunshot. The sound echoed across the fields. Lights flickered in the distance. Somewhere a soldier's voice shouted. Panic surged through Ji-hoon. He dropped to his knees, fumbling for the satchel. He pulled out the last crumbs of dried corn husk and tossed them toward the dog. The animal sniffed, barked again, but the scent of food distracted it enough to quiet for a moment. Still, the damage was done. The alarm had been raised. Run, Ji-hoon hissed, grabbing Dong-wook's hand and pulling him forward. Yoon-hee followed, clutching Min-jun as tears streaked her face. Behind them, the bark resumed, louder, frenzied. Shouts grew clearer. Boots pounded against the frozen soil. Searchlights swept the fields like hungry eyes. Ji-hoon's lungs burned as he sprinted, every muscle screaming for air. He could feel Dong-wook stumbling, nearly falling, but he refused to let go. For every heartbeat, Ji-hoon imagined the crack of a rifle splitting the night. He imagined Yoon-hee collapsing, Min-jun wailing, Dong-wook's small body going limp in his arms. He pushed the thoughts away, forcing his legs to move faster. In that desperate flight, one truth seared itself into him. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was a line they either crossed tonight or never. The moon hung low, casting a pale silver glow on the frozen landscape. After what felt like endless running, Ji-hoon and the others stumbled into a thicket of bare willows. Beyond the trees, the sound of rushing water filled the night air. The river, the border, the line between death and freedom. Ji-hoon collapsed to his knees, pulling Dong-wook close as the boy gasped for breath. Dong-hee clutched Min-jun tightly, her face streaked with sweat and tears despite the biting cold. They were so close, yet the sound of distant shouts and snapping branches told them the soldiers were closing in. The river stretched before them, wide and menacing. Its surface shimmered with ice, but the current was strong, black water cutting through the night like a serpent. Ji-hoon's stomach tightened. He had always known this moment would come, but standing at the edge, he felt the full weight of the choice. We have to cross, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Dongwook's small hand gripped his sleeve. Appa, I'm scared. Ji-hoon bent down, pressing his forehead to his son's. So am I, but we'll do it together. Yoon-hee looked at him, her lips trembling. If we fail, we won't, Ji-hoon interrupted, though fear churned inside him like the river itself. There was no time. The bark of orders rang out in the distance. A beam of light swept across the far bank, grazing the tops of the trees. Ji-hoon stripped off his tattered coat, wrapping it around Dongwook. Hold tight, don't let go of me, no matter what, he waded in first. The icy water bit into his flesh like knives, stealing the breath from his lungs. Dongwook clung to his back, his arms trembling around his father's neck. Yoon-hee followed, clutching Minjun high above the water, her face pale but resolute. The current tugged at them, merciless, trying to drag them under. Ji-hoon's legs burned, his chest heaved, but he pushed forward, step by step. Behind him, Yoon-hee stumbled, her foot caught in the riverbed. She let out a sharp cry. Ji-hoon turned, his heart shattering at the sight of her struggling. The cries of soldiers grew louder, their boots thundering closer. The choice was cruel and clear. Freedom lay only a few strokes ahead, but death loomed behind. And in that moment, Ji-hoon realized the river demanded everything. The far bank of the river was a blur of shadow and ice, but Ji-hoon's hands and legs refused to give up. Each step forward was agony, his muscles screaming, the icy current tugging him backward. Behind him, the voices of Korean soldiers were sharp and close. Yet ahead lay the faint glimmer of freedom, a cluster of trees, a safe haven just beyond reach. Yuna's cry still echoed in his ears. Her foot had twisted, and Min-jun's small body quivered against her chest. Ji-hoon could not leave them. Summoning every last ounce of strength, he reached them and pulled Yoonhee's injured foot from the clinging mud. Together, they pushed forward, the icy water swallowing their legs, soaking them to the bone. Dongwook clung to Ji-hoon, whispering prayers under his breath. Then it happened, a low snap of ice under Yoonhee's foot, and the current threatened to drag Min-jun from her arms. Panic gripped Ji-hoon's chest, but he lunged, catching the child just as the water tried to claim him. For a heartbeat, it seemed the river itself would punish them for daring to hope. Finally, with one last heaving pull, they tumbled onto the opposite shore. The ground beneath them was solid, covered with snow, but the night air was filled with silence. The shouts of the Korean soldiers had not followed, yet the danger was still etched in their minds. Ji-hoon wrapped his family tightly, shivering from both cold and relief. No one spoke for long minutes. The river behind them glistened in the moonlight, a reminder of what they had risked and almost lost. Ji-hoon looked at Yoon-hee, her face streaked with tears and soot, and Dongwook clutching his sleeve. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, a small, fragile smile broke across each of their faces. The cost of freedom had been terrifyingly high. They were battered, exhausted, and marked by fear, but alive. And in that stark moment, Ji-hoon realized something profound. Even in the harshest shadows of North Korea, courage, love, and determination could carve a path to hope. As dawn broke over the distant mountains, the family took their first steps away from the river, away from oppression, and toward a life where tomorrow was theirs to shape. Their journey was not over, but for the first time. They could breathe without fear, and the river that had almost ended them now carried them into the promise of freedom.